In the history of modern art, Pablo Picasso, 1881 to 1973, is a mythological figure. Independent and strong-willed, Picasso had established his own studio in Barcelona, Spain by 1899, and as an 18-year-old entered into the social, cultural, and political life of the modern movement. He frequented the new café El Quatre Gars, a center for artists and cultural intellectuals who introduced Picasso to Art Nouveau and symbolist-influenced poster works, as well as anarchist politics. After 1900, Picasso spent much time in Paris, remaining there from 1904 to 1947, when he moved to the south of France. In his Blue period, 1901 to 1904, he depicted the world of the impoverished and needy. Works from his Rose period, 1905 to 1908, are characterized by a lighter palette and a greater lyricism, with subjects often drawn from circus life. In 1907, Picasso created Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, a work now considered to be a seminal work in development of Cubism and modern abstraction, which shows the influences of both African art and Cézanne. In 1937, Picasso produced his second landmark painting, Guernica, to protest the bombing of the Spanish town of that name. Dark tonalities remained in Picasso's works from 1945 on. In the 1950s and 1960s, Picasso also painted free variations of historical artists he admired. Many of these were painted in his studio at La Villa Californie, overlooking Cannes. The amazing productivity that is part of the Picasso legend produced a steady stream of works in a variety of media, themes, forms, and styles, which continued until his death at the age of 92. Picasso's mother tells us his first word was pis, an abbreviated form of the Spanish for pencil, lápiz. The implication that the child genius could draw before he could talk seemed verified later by the 13-year-old who had mastered the drawing of the human body and by the man who all his life filled notebooks with sketches. The young Pablo Ruiz, after his family name, made such quick progress under his father's tutelage at art school that Don Jose gave up his own palette and brushes to his son. At 14, the young Pablo blazed through the advanced exams for classical art and still life in the Barcelona Art School. They normally take a month to complete. He finished in a week. This first large canvas, First Communion, 1895, painted by Picasso at the age of 15, is academic in its command of the human form and the technique of oil painting. Science and Charity, 1897. His second large oil painting showed the same mastery through a darker palette. Picasso's father was reportedly the model for the doctor seen here, representing science, and his sister Lola, the dying woman. This early self-portrait, 1900, embodies the haunting melancholy of the symbolist and expressionist traditions in which Picasso was fully engaged prior to his arrival in France. Buoyed by the environment of Barcelona and having a painting selected for exhibition in the 1900 Paris Universal Exposition, Picasso made his first visit to Paris in October of that year. His destination was the colony of Spanish painters in Montmartre, a place he would eventually call home for 10 years. The brief visit, guided by his friends who knew the cafes, galleries, and dealers, allowed him to examine firsthand the works of the French Impressionists. This painting, Le Moulin de la Galette, 1900, is Picasso's first picture in Paris. Paris, as it has done so many times with its artists, reached out to the young Picasso, who decided his future lay in the City of Lights. There was a brief return to Spain, some canvases painted in various styles he had absorbed in Paris, and a general restlessness in the young painter that led him by May of 1901 back to Paris and a permanent settling of his own shared studio. he started to use the name of his mother, Dona Maria Picasso y Lopez. By June, he had arranged his first exhibition in Paris. His symbolist work, combined with brighter colors, in a style his later friend and rival Henri Matisse explored within the French Expressionist movement known as les fauves, the wild beasts. By the fall of 1901, Picasso's canvases began to be dominated by blue and gray tonalities, and Picasso established his first recognized phase of art, known as the Blue Period, which ran from late 1901 until the middle of 1904. In this painting, The Blue Room, 1901, the blues and grays of the walls and bedding make this a transitional work to Picasso's Blue Period. The bathing nude is typical from Impressionism, but unlike that school of art, the room and her isolation seem more the subject of the painting. During the Blue Period, Picasso introduced a cast of characters and themes that remained throughout his life. The Harlequin, 1901, is a comic pantomime figure considered part rogue, part buffoon. Picasso saw something of himself in the character and portrayed it frequently as a surrogate self-portrait, later depicting his young son as the same figure. The theater attracted Picasso in Barcelona, along with other members of the Bohemian culture. On more than one occasion, Picasso likened aspects of artistic creativity to play and playing, by which he likely meant references to both the childlike state of mind, much celebrated by Expressionists and later the Surrealists, and theatrical masking as a metaphor for freedom. The Old Guitarist, 1903, Picasso's Blue Period, dealt with the isolation of aged and social outcasts. The attenuated proportions suggest the influence of El Greco, an artist the Spanish symbolists restored to public attention, and one who seems to have particularly affected Picasso. The Actor, 1904. The colors in this work show Picasso in transition between his blue and rose periods. The emphasis on hand gestures and head, and the use of an elongated, curvilinear body are typical of his early works. Picasso's largest allegorical painting from this period, La Vie, Life, 1903, was painted on a return to his home city of Barcelona. The male figure here closely resembles his friend Carlos Casagemas, who had recently committed suicide in a Paris café over a lost love. In the original drawings, the male figure was a self-portrait, yet it remains a commentary on the nature of life from a symbolist perspective. The last of Picasso's blue paintings date from the spring and summer of 1904 and coincided with the end of his traveling between Paris and Barcelona. From this point, Picasso remained in France. He settled into a rundown studio building at 13 Rue Avignon in Montmartre. Now firmly part of the Parisian scene, he began his second series, dubbed his Rose Period, which he first exhibited as a group in February of 1905, Family of Saltimbanque, 1905. The importance for Picasso of the circus performers of Montmartre in Paris is attested to by the size of this canvas, 7 square feet. It was at the weekly salon of Léon and Gertrude Stein, newly arrived in Paris from the United States, that two painters who were to form two of the major dispositions of art for the 20th century met. Portrait of Gertrude Stein, 1905. This is one of the few portraits the painter made directly from the model. The beginning of a new style can be seen in the mask-like face and the fusion between the figure and background planes. In addition, his 7-year relationship with Fernande Olivier had begun by the autumn of 1904. She was to be the first of several significant women in his long life, all of whom were well recorded in his art. Meditation, Contemplation, 1904. The artist contemplated a woman as a traditional allegorical representation, but the muse is real. Fernande Olivier appears in this work. Woman Ironing, 1904. This subject was a favorite of French painter Edgar Degas, but is rendered here less as an impressionistic slice of life and more as a figure of pathos. It is partly a testament to the reality of the hardships young women faced while seeking a better life in the City of Lights. The Frugal Repast, 1904. The starkness of the characters and style of the Blue Period translated easily in the medium of printmaking. This was Picasso's second effort at etching, a technique he explored extensively in his more expressive period of the 1930s. Mother and Child, 1904. The woman is the model for many works from this period, but only her name, Madeleine, is known. The theme of maternity joins the theme of the Madonna and Child to everyday life. At the Lapin Agile, 1905. This is the first painting where Picasso clearly painted his own likeness into the role of the Harlequin figure, the gaudy clothing in contrast to the melancholy psychology of the young Picasso. This painting was nailed to the wall of the bar Le Lapin Agile, the Agile Rabbit, taking its place among many others swapped by artists for drinks with its owner, Fred. Lady with a Fan, 1905. It is part of a group in late 1905 in which the moods of detachment and austerity seem to increase as they transition from blue into rose colorations. La Toilette, 1906. The rose tonalities remain, but Picasso's figures began to take on a greater sense of dimension and weight, as seen here. Their sense of size and quietude made them appear classical by modern standards, a spirit likely derived from the artist's interest in sculptural forms, begun in late 1905. Self-Portrait with a Palette, 1906. The simplified, severe mask used for his own face shows Picasso's interest in the pre-Roman sculptures of his Spanish homeland he had seen in the Louvre. The body has been primitivized through its simplification into crude, bulky shapes. Boy Leading a Horse, 1906. In the development of Picasso's work, rose tonalities gave way to grays and browns. Physical form was no longer taken for granted, and is here different from the sketchy, attenuated, and unfinished qualities of his earlier works. The influence of French painter Paul Cézanne's figures is seen in the thick contours. Two Nudes, 1906. As part of a series of large-bodied female nudes, these figures show Picasso working his way through his exposure to Iberian sculpture with a new simplicity of form. The figures have the solidity of sculpture. Self-Portrait, 1907. Picasso likely enjoyed the correlation between the large, staring eyes of ethnographic masks and his own well-known intensity. Two major influences appeared now in fairly quick order in Picasso's works: that of the post-impressionist painter Paul Cézanne, and the impact of what generally but carefully can be called primitive art. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, 1907. Few works can be credited with altering the course of art history. The so-called death of Renaissance painting dates from this picture, even though the concept was challenged earlier on many other artistic fronts across Europe. Considered by many to be the beginning of Cubism, this work is a sketchbook of developing ideas and influences. The characters have undergone a threefold influence: Egyptian, in the flattening of the torso of the woman on the left; Iberian, in the nose of each of the two women in the center, it's seen in profile, whereas the other features are face-on; and African. The cast of features of the woman on the right is reminiscent of the Congolese masks at the Trocadero Museum. The influence of African sculpture is most clearly seen in the complex mask replacing the facial features in this celebrated painting. But the lessons of Cézanne's series of bathers is also apparent in the overall composition and in stylistic experiments, such as the bending of the shoulder into space through juxtaposition of planes of color. Three Women, 1908. Picasso developed the figure and its relation to the surrounding space through ideas he discovered in African art. The issues eventually became the basis for Cubism, but in this work there is a greater stress on the abstract dynamism of the rhythms of pose and body parts rendered through cubic planes of color. Cubism is regarded as one of the seminal art movements of the 20th century for several reasons. Although it originated from a private dialogue between Pablo Picasso and the French artist Georges Braque from about 1907 through 1914, it was enjoined by a large number of other like-minded artists. Cubism gave voice to a new spirit concurrent with the new millennium across the broad spectrum of Western culture. Woman with Pears, 1909. Picasso applied his new artistic geometry to his companion Fernand Olivier, developing an ability to reconstruct the face through smaller planes of color. The planar look also results in an oil painting that suggests itself as three-dimensional, shallow relief sculpture. Head of a Woman, 1909. At crucial points in his investigation of new ways to represent the old problem of three-dimensional form on a two-dimensional canvas, Picasso turned to sculpture. The parallels between this painting and sculpture are apparent. The Renaissance vision of art effectively ended with the death of Cézanne in 1906, even if the full implications had not yet been worked out. Factory at Horta de Ebro, 1909. Picasso painted an important series of landscapes in Spain during the summer of 1909 under the influence of Georges Braque. In them, he aligned and interlocked geometric planes to produce a more cohesive vision of related forms. The works painted in Horta de Ebro were not only Picasso's first fully realized Cubist paintings, they initiated a period known as Analytic Cubism, to be followed in 1912 by a period called Synthetic Cubism. Bread and Fruit Dish on a Table, 1909. Analytic Cubism is frequently characterized by the process of painting as much as by how the works look. The overall characteristic of Analytic Cubism is exactly what one might expect, an analytic process, as first introduced by Cézanne, by which the forms in the world are broken down into planes of color. Reversing the normal process, Cubists painted the background first and the foreground last. Thus, Cubist pictures tend to advance toward the viewer. Girl with a Mandolin, 1910. As the developing language of Cubism was applied to the full human form, one senses the whole of the form of the model, while the surrounding space gained a new presence and presented new problems to be solved. Portrait of Ambroise Vollard, 1910. The art dealer often stated that friends could not recognize him from this portrait, but a 4-year-old had no problem doing so, shouting, "That's Vollard." Portrait of Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, 1910. The German dealer was a strong supporter of the Cubist movement, and his Paris gallery held many of the important exhibitions. His portrait is considered one of the best examples of analytic Cubism due to its evident penetration of space and form. By 1911, Picasso's painting The Accordioniste seemed entirely abstract, the subject identifiable only by the title. Almost inseparable from the experiments of Georges Braque, works such as these are considered the high point of analytic Cubism, when identifiable form almost disappears. Man with a Pipe, 1911. The late summer of 1911 in Céret was an intense period of interaction between Picasso and Braque, producing their first experiments with reproducing precisely real fragments of letters and words in their paintings. The references words had to the real world, the world beyond the painted object, were often utilized on a literal level. Words often referred to local newspaper titles, events, or even personal statements, such as to celebrate love, as Picasso did for the new woman in his life. Ma Jolie, Woman with a Guitar, 1911. The words "ma jolie" were reportedly Picasso's pet name for his new love, Eva Guel, Marcel Humbert, derived from a popular love song, which roughly translates as, "My pretty one, my heart says hello." Analytic Cubism had created pictures by breaking down, analyzing, form and space into greater abstractions of lines and planes. Man with a Hat, 1912. Picasso's use of glued papers, following Braque, often employed humor to raise serious questions. Here, the techniques of modeling through light, the newspaper, and dark, the blue rectangle, construct an alternative to the academic techniques of modeling through the application of gradual light. Guitar, 1912. The touchstone to Picasso's understanding of new relationships between real and painted forms remains sculpture. Here, the constructed metal planes invert sculpture's traditional relationship between mass and volume. This inversion would come to have important ramifications in sculpture, as well as in architecture and design. Bottle of Suze, 1912. Newspapers, labels, and wallpaper combine with drawing and painting in more complex collages such as this work. In addition to being crucial parts of the particular painting, the newspaper articles often referred to contemporary events as well. Many of the changes were gradual. In a painting such as The Aficionado, 1912, much of the legibility of the analytic remains. The diaphanous color planes begin to solidify and simplify as Braque and Picasso turned from an analytic to a synthetic approach to form and painting. The bullfight fan is as recognizable as the figures from works in 1910. The use of color planes continues, but they are less airy and light, more hardened and solid. Violin and Grapes, 1912. The greater size of the colored planes mark what is termed synthetic cubism, while the painted imitation of a wood grain plays with the interchange of the reality of the wooden guitar and glued papers. In one of Picasso's most famous works from the synthetic cubism stage, Still Life with Chair Caning, 1912, the letters JOU appear. They refer to the Paris newspaper Le Journal, a reference intended to snap the viewer away from art and back to the real world. Delighting in the new interplay between illusion and reality, glued papers and pieces of the real world were introduced here by Picasso into the illusionistic world of painting. The actual rope surrounding the oval is interpreted as a replacement for the ornate wooden frames of traditional painting. Guitar, 1913. The severe restriction of color in the analytic phase of Cubism gave way to an increased range of colors in the synthetic phase, and by 1913, a more decorative note began to develop in Picasso and other painters' works. Cubist space in painting defined the nature of modern space as flat yet interactive. Geometric Composition, the Guitar, 1913. It was not unusual for Picasso to work at the same time in different but related directions. Neither Braque nor Picasso painted in a totally abstract manner, but they clearly thought in abstract terms. The only actual relation this composition has to the reality of the object is via its title. Mandolin and Clarinet, 1913. Attached to a back plane of wood, the sculptural experiments from this period were constructed relief sculptures using found or junk elements. The ensemble extends from the walls like three-dimensional cubist paintings. The interchange between the two media is virtually complete, and Picasso would soon take leave of sculpture for several years. Student with a Pipe, 1913. Few artists understood more or applied better their humor to art than did Picasso. He intuitively grasped the kinship between the faculties of humor and creativity. The use of sand here was a simple statement declaring that any material could be made into art through creative application. Glass of Absinthe, 1914. The bitter taste of the popular green-colored liqueur was a favorite alcoholic drink of many. The bronze painted sugar cube, used to offset its taste, and the real silver sugar strainer complete the humorous reference to its reality. Violin and bottle on a table, 1915. The use of paint in the wooden relief sculptures became a physical component visually equal to the wooden planes. The assertion of the physical weight of color eventually became a major component of 20th century architecture and design. Harlequin, 1915. In a letter to Gertrude Stein in December 1915, Picasso wrote, "My life is hell. However, I have made a picture of a harlequin that is the best thing I have ever done." The harlequin symbol remained an integral part of the artist's life and initiated a new series of works, culminating in The Three Musicians. The synthetic cubist paintings became thicker, more material and colorful. Works from late 1913 to the 1920s are often designated as decorative or a Rococo form of cubism. Picasso was to retain the bright colors introduced here with the broadened flat planes of synthetic cubism in one fashion or another for the rest of his life. Untitled, man with a mustache, buttoned vest, and pipe, seated in an armchair, 1915. In spite of the gay feeling generated by this so-called Rococo cubist painting, at the time of its completion, France was at war, Braque was wounded. Picasso had referred to his relationship with Georges Braque as a kind of faithful marriage. But when Braque returned from the Great War in March 1916 with a serious head wound, he was a different person in a different world and unable to adjust to Picasso and his new place in it. The end of the collaboration was apparently due in large measure to Braque's attitude, but also to changes in his former colleague's life and direction. Much had changed. Picasso now lived the life of a financially successful and well-known artist. Picasso and Eva González, his companion since late 1911, had moved twice by the summer of 1913, from the Bohemian quarters of Montmartre to arrive in the quarter of Paris on the left bank of the Seine known as Montparnasse, whose cafés were the centers of Parisian artistic and intellectual life. Here he had a spacious studio, a maidservant, and had begun a more formalized style of life by the outbreak of war in August 1914. The approaching of the war's front line toward Paris and the lingering illness and eventual death of Eva in December of 1915 opened a new front line for Picasso. Woman in Spanish Costume, 1917. Composing over a drawn figure with small points of pure, intense color was a technique adapted from the late 19th and early 20th century French neo-impressionists. In 1916, Picasso undertook the set and costume design for a new ballet titled Parade and composed by a French writer, Jean Cocteau. It was to be performed by the well-known company, the Ballet Russe, under the direction of Sergei Diaghilev. Picasso's experience with Parade led him to Rome, where he met Olga Koklova, a dancer with the company. Living together by 1917 and married in July 1918, life for the painter moved toward the high society that Olga, the daughter of a Russian general, expected and desired. Olga Picasso in an Armchair, 1917. Women Bathing, 1918. In this picture, painted in Biarritz during the summer of 1918, just after his marriage with Olga, Picasso amused himself by combining in his own way a number of pictorial references, such as Seurat, Le Douanier, Rousseau, Botticelli, and Inger's Turkish Bath. Sleeping Peasants, 1919. Typically through small studies and drawings, Picasso anticipated his own change in style to the more robust and physical figures he developed in the early 1920s. This colorful work in tempera, watercolor, and pencil has openly erotic overtones, equated with a natural life in the country. Whether the classical ambiance of Rome or the simplified volumes of the figures of the ancient Roman wall paintings he visited while in Italy had any impact is difficult to assess. But a third style developed, one dominated by large-scale figures and referred to as Mediterranean classicism or colossal figures. Three Women at the Spring, 1921. The monumental figures which appeared early in Picasso's neoclassical phase were frequently referred to as great sculptural friezes. In this painting, the use of the term classicism refers not only to their clothing, but their sense of quietude and the simplification of the form through geometric volumes. The two versions of The Three Musicians make emphatic use of relatively simple large planes united in deceptively complex spatial cues. The Three Musicians, 1921. The New York variation of this well-known painting is more simplified in its forms than its complement, and includes the dark form of a large dog. The darkened background tonalities and the apparently more sinister figure on the end of both paintings has led to the interpretation of these two paintings as harbingers of the change in psychological mood Picasso's work would soon undergo. The Three Musicians, 1921. The Philadelphia seen here is more intricate and varied in form and color. The Pipes of Pan, 1923. This work is part of the artist's neoclassic series and was painted at Antibes in the summer. Picasso felt he was more in touch with ancient mythology when summering in the south of France by the sea. The earliest geometric volumes have given way to a more naturalistic handling of the bodies, locked in by a simplified, plainer background. Mandolin and Guitar, 1924. Always present, in the 1920s, Picasso's Cubist language was elaborated into light-filled and colorful compositions. Seldom is the Cubist vocabulary so brilliant and so bold as in this series of still lifes. In 1923 to 1925, Picasso had met André Breton and been adopted by the Surrealists. The Surrealists welcomed poets and painters who stressed the role of the unconscious and the ways the subterranean part of the human psyche manifested itself in dreams, fantasy, and spontaneous or automatic acts of mind and hand. Nude in an Armchair, 1929. The nude is apparently a reformulation, or metamorphosis as Picasso favored, of the tradition of luxurious female sensuality. By 1925, the dance used flat, flesh-toned figures, high-stepping in a shallow space against equally flat planes of interior walls and windows, a basic late cubic vocabulary of forms. The Embrace, 1925. This canvas is considered by some, along with The Dance, as the beginning of a more violent psychological approach by the artist toward his subjects. Gone are the endearing family moments of the early 1920s, replaced by a more primal representation of lust. As with his art, so too had changes continued in Picasso's life. Olga bore Picasso's first son, Paolo, in 1921, but by 1925, the marriage was having difficulty. Paolo as Harlequin, 1924. Among Picasso's many portraits of his first son, few are as endearing as those of Paolo dressed in costumes from the theater figures of his father's Rose period. In January of 1927, Picasso introduced himself to 17-year-old Marie-Thérèse Walter and offered to paint her portrait. 6 months later, they were lovers. Sleeping Nude, 1932. In the midst of Picasso's more terroristic portrayals of the female form came luxurious and sensual biomorphic paintings. There is an open eroticism in the curvilinear qualities and bright colors in his long series of works inspired by his relation with Marie-Thérèse. Head of a Woman, 1932. Typically, Picasso worked in several styles simultaneously in painting and culture. This portrait of Marie-Thérèse Walter is part of a series based on her face, cast in the more traditional medium of bronze, while at the same time Picasso was pioneering welded iron. The painter was also as capable of rendering the enigmatic as the Surrealists, and showed it in what is considered a masterwork of the 1930s, Girl Before a Mirror, 1932. The central theme is the voluptuous body of Marie-Thérèse, rendered in rounded organic forms, but the narrative seems a modern psychological inversion of the old theme of vanity. The Red Armchair, 1931. Her likeness appeared regularly in his art, although he kept her identity secret for many years. By 1930, he installed her a few doors away from his home. He bought, the same year in the country outside of Paris, the Château de Boisjaloux, which became a center for his artwork, with the barn converted in 1931 into a sculpture studio. This was a period of happiness in Picasso's life. An exhibition of his work had opened in New York City in 1929, with major retrospective exhibitions, first in London in 1931 and a year later in Paris. Woman in Red Armchair, 1932. Part of Picasso's continuing series of the female body in the early 1930s, this work came at a time when the painter was illustrating Ovid's Metamorphose, and itself seems a final transition of the figurative tradition through a combination of surrealist and abstract styles. Crucifixion, 1930. Picasso's abilities with bright, harsh colors in combination with cubist planes, surrealist curves, and fantastic creatures imposed a tortured sensibility on any painted figure or scene. In this work, one feels the agony often associated with the death of the Christ figure, though in quite modern, symbolic terms of style. Seated Bather, 1930. Picasso's final metamorphosis of the classical tradition was achieved with figures that reminded observers of petrified bones and insect-like monstrosities. Here, the traditional female nude beach bather, symbol of the sensuality of the Mediterranean traditions, has become monstrous. The Surrealists had adopted the mythological image of the Minotaur as their chief symbol. Picasso used the Minotaur in sketches from the late 1920s, but in the 1930s, and for the rest of his life, he accepted the creature as a replacement for the Harlequin, a new surrogate self-portrait. In May of 1933, Picasso designed the cover of the new surrealist journal titled Minotaur. This work depicts the well-known mythic figure, a loaded symbol for the artist, which also served him through a number of levels of meaning. Bullfight, Death of the Toreador, 1933. At the age of 7, Picasso was attending bullfights with his father, while his earliest painting was of a picador. The bullfight remained a personal passion, which provided a staging ground for elemental violence in his paintings. Here, both toreador and horse die in agony. Minotaur and Nude, 1933. One of the incarnations of the Minotaur was the personification of animal passion. Although this series of drawings has been variously titled to include a battle with the mythic Amazons, the primary emotion appears to be lust. The world view of the brutality engendered by the mythic portrayals of the unconscious are often considered preludes to Picasso's major painting of the 1930s. Like so much visual art and writing worldwide, this painting was inspired by the Spanish Civil War, specifically the destruction of the Basque town of Guernica by German bombers in the service of Spanish fascists on April 26, 1937. The Republican government of Spain called on him to represent them, and Picasso in turn called upon the terror and pity he had pictured in his own works since 1925 to not only transmit those qualities to others of his time, but to encapsulate the horrors of war for the entire 20th century. Few paintings can summarize such a vast segment of the human character. Guernica still stands today as an icon, a modern history painting in a period that frequently turns its back on history. It was executed in virtually 1 month's time between May and June 1937 for the Spanish pavilion of the Paris World's Fair. A huge canvas measuring 11 by 25.5 feet, it was painted bereft of color using stark blacks, whites, and grays. At center is the agonized death of his horse from the bullfights, likely representing the loyal people of Spain. Screaming women from the painter's surrealist lexicon flank the scene left and right, while a horned bull with the head of the Minotaur bellows in the left background. The fragmented and decapitated body of a figure is thrown across the foreground, the broken Roman short sword still held in a dismembered hand. Women with rounded profile faces and both eyes on one side of the head, also part of his vocabulary developed in the 1930s, sweep in from the viewer's right. All exist in the collapsed space of a basic Cubist composition. Each part had been seen before, but nothing can account for the new totality. While staying in a small village near Cannes in the late summer of 1937, he entertained the daughter of a Yugoslav architect. Dora Maar was a photographer, and Picasso invited her to photograph his studio. She soon became the fourth prominent woman in his life. The liveliness of her personality is seen in a 1937 portrait, Dora Maar Seated, whose sharp features are enhanced by a Cubist style and bright colors. The angular, sharp planes and tear-stricken pose of Weeping Woman, 1937, picture Dora Maar in the more anguished style of Guernica, something Picasso wrestled with for many months following completion of the heroic mural. Maya in a Sailor Suit, 1938. Picasso painted fairly formalized portraits of his daughter, born in 1935 of his union with Marie-Thérèse, as he had of his son Paolo in the 1920s. His crude signature on her cap argues for Picasso himself as a child, and supports his later agreement that this, too, was a surrogate self-portrait. By September of 1938, the ominous signs of war appeared once again. Guernica was on tour to raise money for the Spanish resistance, while serving as virtual testimony for the atrocities of war. The summer of 1939, Picasso spent in the idyls of southern France, as was his habit, at Antibes with Dora Maar. Night Fishing at Antibes, 1939, was based on scenes observed in evening strolls with Maar. Fishermen spear fish by nightlights, while Dora and Jacqueline Lamba, the wife of André Breton, stand to the right watching as in a dreamscape. Same year, Germany invaded Poland in early September. With England and France declaring war, Picasso retired to Royan, a town on the Atlantic Ocean near the city of Bordeaux. He remained here with month-long visits to Paris for art supplies and to work while maintaining his contacts. Many of his friends were mobilized at a time when he painted Woman Dressing Her Hair, once again combining Cubist and Surrealist vocabularies. On one such trip in May 1940, he left Paris just ahead of the German occupation. With a French armistice signed in June, German troops were garrisoned in Royan. Uncomfortable with their presence, he returned to Paris with Maar, where he finished Woman Dressing Her Hair. In Paris, Picasso's collection was confiscated by the Nazis. Despite offers to live abroad, he remained in Paris and opened a studio in his new quarters, Rue des Grands Augustins. Head of a Bull, 1943. The conversion of discarded parts of a bicycle clearly places art in the vision of the artist as much as in the object itself. In Paris, during the war, in May 1943, Picasso met a young painter named Françoise Gillot. As her visits resumed, her portrait began to appear in his drawing. Seated Woman, 1946. Developments in the war, however, took precedent. Street fighting in mid-August of 1944 moved Picasso into the apartment with Marie-Thérèse and Maya. Paris was liberated that same August, with mixtures of sadness and celebration. Several of Picasso's Jewish friends had been arrested and lost their lives in the concentration camps or shortly thereafter. The first photographs of the atrocities were seen at that time. Under these circumstances, Picasso produced a smaller pendant painting to Guernica in 1945. Its title, The Charnel House, evoked the death camps. The pile of tied and dismembered bodies was painted in the same stark colors as Guernica, but the angularity and protest was missing. Their deaths were a completed act, the painting a quiet memorial. On the other hand, with the liberation came a revived sense of life, and nowhere was it more active than in Picasso's studio. Picasso appeared to welcome all comers and agreed to participate in his first official French public salon, Le Salon de la Libération. Dark tonalities remained in Picasso's work from 1945, vying with the brighter colors. Bought a house for Dora Maar, but began keeping Gillot as a mistress, with much of the familiar complications for his personal life. In 1947, their son Claude was born, and in 1949, their daughter Paloma, named in Spanish for the dove of peace that Picasso had designed. Woman with a Baby Carriage, 1950. The birth of two children through his union with Françoise Gillot seemed to have prompted in Picasso's work ever more of the child artist at creative play. In the interim, they had moved to a villa in the hills above Vallauris. By 1952, his relation with Françoise was deteriorating, and in 1953, she took leave of the villa with the children. In the summer of 1953, while traveling with his daughter Maya, Picasso met Jacqueline Roch, who would become the sixth significant woman to enter his life. Her portrait appeared in 1954 at about the time they began living together. They were married in 1961. Woman by a Window, 1956. Jacqueline Roch was the last companion to Picasso and his second wife. She was the model for many of the luxurious female nudes in his later years. For 20 years, Jacqueline was at Picasso's side, as wife, muse, lover, and also as the one who saw to the practical details concerning the painter's way of living, attentive as she was to his every need. Perhaps it was mortality, or rather immortality, that was on his mind when he began to paint over 40 variations of the Maid of Honor, Las Melinas, 1970, by the great Spanish Baroque painter Velázquez. A great challenge for Picasso was recasting the most famous painting of his most famous 17th century countryman, Velázquez. In the 1950s and 1960s, Picasso painted free variations of Nicolas Poussin, Luca Cranach, and Eugène Delacroix, but nothing on the scale of Las Meninas, the Maids of Honor. The 40-plus works in the series were donated to the Barcelona Picasso Museum in memory of Picasso's lifelong friend, Jaime Sarbatez. Women of Algiers after Delacroix, 1955. Eugène Delacroix was considered the foremost colorist of the Romantic period of 19th century France, and his painting, based on women seen in North Africa, the epitome of the modern odalisques. Picasso could not resist such a challenge. Seated Old Man, 1970. The late and brutal candor of Picasso, often given over a sense of voyeuristic compensation for the loss of earlier sexual passions, also spawned a series of expressively rendered old men and cavaliers caught between coloristic celebrations of life fulfilled, melancholy acceptance of the waning tissues of life, and wry symbols of love's labors lost. There was a gigantic battle going on with the little time that was left to him. Here he was, launching forth into badly done things, the most summary of outlines, the most indefensible of mistakes of composition, vulgarity of execution, as if old age had made it impossible for him to concentrate, only to redeem all at the very last moment, imposing his indelible imprint on various versions of Embrace, Couple, Kisses, that would frighten fashionable critics away when they were exhibited in Avignon in 1970 and 1973. There would also emerge from the domain of the impossible in painting a bather standing, a child with a spade, a motherhood, nudes seated or lying down, musicians with bold expressiveness, all the more striking as they were perched on the edge of the abyss, the final silence of the paintbrush at the end of 1972. In September 1956, Picasso had bought the Château de Vauvenargues at the foot of the Montagne Sainte-Victoire. It was there, at the foot of the great stone staircase, that he would be buried in April 1973.